So, Ajax, how does it actually work? Oh. Well, whoops, a second, before I do that, what is it? That's a better question first. Whoops. So what is it? Ajax, well, literally, it comes from asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's a term that the person who first thought of using the tools this way came up with. So originally, it always was designed to use XML as the transport mechanism. The JSON stuff only came in afterwards when people said, I don't want to write all that extra XML-ish stuff. I just want to send the data back and forth. Hence, JSON was created. So, what is it? It's not any one particular technology. It's not one piece of code. It's really a way of approaching a particular set of problems. And so it's really a set of tools and techniques that you use based upon JavaScript that allows the client side to communicate directly with the server side, okay, without having to do full page reloads, okay? That's what this next thing is saying, is that before people started thinking this way and putting the tools together this way, anytime you needed to update an HTML page, I mean, outside of doing some local JavaScript stuff, but if you wanted to update it with new server information, that means you had to do an entire round trip of the entire page, okay? Ajax allows you to update the pages without reloading them completely. So that's the essence of what Ajax is good for. How does it work? Well, and this was always built into JavaScript. There's this particular object called XML HTTP request object. That was already built into it. And I don't think originally people knew what they were going to do with it. But what it does is it allows you to make a full-blown HTTP request. So in other words, it's still using the same protocol that the full page loads does, except what it's doing is it's allowing you to send small amounts of data to do very particular kinds of things. So basically, using this object and its methods, you could, as a JavaScript coder, then update, along with the other things we were talking about, the DHTML stuff, allowed you to request information from the server or actually send information, ask the server to make changes, and then get responses back without having to get the entire page sent back. And so then, using the other DHTML pieces that we just looked at, could make changes to the page without having to recreate the entire thing. Now, there's certain examples, I'll show you some examples, but what this leads nowadays is to some sites, and I don't remember whether I talked about this before, but there's this idea of what's called an SPA, a single page application. That takes this to its ultimate sort of idea. In other words, instead of getting different pages, kind of the way that you're writing your applications, which is perfectly reasonable, the idea behind SPAs is that you essentially have one page that you load, and then you never reload the page. You simply update it with pieces. Okay? Can you think of an application that you would use, that you've seen, that acts like that? There are a couple of very famous ones. In other words, think of an application, a web-based application that you use, that where the page itself doesn't change very much, just the contents changes.
Twitter's probably one. Facebook.
That's one. What's another one?
Twitter.
Twitter is another one. What's another one? Anybody have a Gmail account?
Yeah, Gmail.
I bet you do. Do you use the browser-based Gmail? Does that not work that way?
Seems good. Feels like.
I mean, most of it doesn't change.
Right.
I mean, you may change the list of files but in terms of the basic look and feel, you don't. Do you ever see it completely reload?
No.
No. Okay. So you say, Huh?
We select some countries and that particular specific states of that country load into that particular pages.
Mhm. So those are just a few of the more famous ones that do that sort of thing. Those are examples of what are called those single-page applications. And that kind of takes this idea to its nth degree. Now, you don't have to write your application to get the benefit of this. And in fact, using the JSF and all the tools that are built into it, you're actually using Ajax. You don't realize it most of the time underneath it, okay? But that's the basic idea, so that the browser will make requests using the JavaScript in the browser to get information or update information on the from the server, update information to the server, and then update the DOM in various ways, both with changing the content or maybe changing the CSS, the styling, all without doing a full page reload. So that's basically the idea. So what is Ajax? It's really a combination of the HTML content structure, the CSS presentation standards, that is the tags and the styling, the ability to do dynamic display and to affect the interaction the user has using JavaScript and manipulating the DOM. Nowadays, it's also data interchange, typically done using JSON, but sometimes XML, with the way that the X originally meant. And one of the most important things, this is the A part, okay, that's very important, is that it is basically asynchronous. You understand what this means here? That means the call is made on the client side without having to block and wait for the response. This is one of the things that makes it so responsive on the client side, because there's a lot of stuff going on underneath to make changes. You're getting new tweets coming in and your feed is updating and all that stuff. That's happening. It's not, when that happens, it doesn't force your whole app to freeze, right? That's because it will make an asynchronous request, and then the tools have the capability of waiting, and they have callbacks, so that when the request is satisfied, or when it fails, the code will be, the client-side code will be notified that in fact happened. So it can continue to go on and do other things while it's doing that, so that you get all of these pieces that are working simultaneously. So that's part of what makes the use of Ajax so nice for the user, because they can be, it's like they're doing multiple things simultaneously, and the system is constantly churning away without having to be freezing, waiting on things. So if you look at it from a kind of a state diagram, the user might type something in or click on something that would cause an Ajax request to go off, but then they don't have to wait for the response. Okay, they can go on and do something else. They do another input, then the server side does more. Eventually, it comes back with the response, et cetera, et cetera. So the A part of Ajax is very important. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that you can make synchronous Ajax calls too, which kind of goes against the name. But there are certain times when you don't want to go on and do other things. You really do want, at least for that portion of your application, you want that to freeze and wait, because you cannot go on without getting a proper response back. So it's less common, but it also happens. So I will give you just the merest taste of how this is done in vanilla JavaScript. And then you thank your deity, whoever he or she happens to be, or it, for the fact that you don't have to do this anymore, because people have done it for you. It's all, if you're a JavaScript programmer, you use one of those tools, jQueries, blah, blah. If you're, even in our case, if you're a JSF programmer, there is actually, I don't know if I mentioned this before, there's actually a JavaScript library called jsf.js that's being loaded for every page that you write in JSF. Okay? So in other words, that's its own, that's the one that comes with the JSF specification, okay? Much of what's in there also has Ajax built into it, along with a lot of other stuff. But then you can layer other things on top of it. You can also use jQuery, you can use Prime Faces, which has jQuery in it, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, this is not an either-or situation. You can use mix and match as you need to get the functionality you want. But underneath, I'll just give you a little taste of what's actually happening. So this XML HTTP request thing is a JavaScript object, okay, which hangs off of the window object. If you look at the JavaScript hierarchy of objects. So this is what you would see in your code, something like this, somewhere. You are going to try to generate a new request object, okay? So assuming that you can do that, it will actually create one. It used to be, I don't know, I guess in some versions this is still true. Microsoft, when of course goes off and does its own stuff, and so you always had to worry about stuff like this. And I'm sure you probably still do in certain ways. But basically what you're trying to do is get a handle on one of these request objects that you're going to use then to transmit stuff to talk to the server. Okay, so assuming we get one of these things, you need to write a function that uses it to call, make a request, and then waits for it to get a response. The request actually goes through a set of phases. It can be either uninitialized, loading, loaded, interactive, or complete. Really, the only one that we're honestly worried about is the last one, whether it finished. Okay, but you can actually, go through all the state changes if that's important to you. So really, the state for complete is what you're looking for. This is what will tell the client side that in fact the call went through and has been responded to. What comes back, these are just HTTP requests. They just happen to be in a particular format. They're not sending back whole HTML pages, they're just sending back little bits and pieces of things. Could be a piece of HTML. It could be a text string of some kind of just, it could be a 1 or a 0. It could be a JSON object. It could be an XML set of XML elements. It could be virtually anything you want that can be transmitted normally. So basically, what you're looking for is a status code of 200. That's standard HTTP OK, and the ready state of 4. Right. So that means it was complete and it came back OK. And then here's just an alert. But obviously your code, whatever it's doing, would then go off and take what it got back and then do something with it. Okay, it might be this request was actually asking for a Twitter feed update. Okay, and what comes back is probably something that looks, I'm not sure exactly how they format theirs, but comes back in maybe JSON format or some other XML-ish format. And then your client-side JavaScript will then take that thing and do whatever you want. It may take it apart, parse it, and then stuff it into some area on the browser screen. Okay? And that would be your feed updating itself. Okay? And again, it didn't require the whole thing to be reloaded. That's the point. So you can send requests to server URLs, and you'll essentially write the code to be ready to respond when it comes back. So here's an example. Here's something here's an example of something that you might see if you were reading RSS feeds, which are like news feeds. Okay? They use particular kinds of formats, RSS or Atom, or those are the two most famous ones. And basically what you're doing is, in this case, this is Yahoo, is got a URL, you can see it there, HTTP, et cetera, and if you do a get on that thing, you will get back some kind of a set of text, some string of something, in some format that then you can do something with. Okay, so this is you doing the request. This is the Ajax request that's going to go ask for, give me the whatever top stories will return, and then send it, okay? What will come back, if assuming that it comes back successfully, is something that might look like this, which is, this happens to be XML style, okay? But, you know, RSS, RDF, Atom, those are all essentially definitions of what this format looks like. And so you would know what was coming back, and then your code would then take that thing over on the right-hand side, which came back from that call, a successful call, and then pull it apart and do whatever you want. Take the, you know, the first one and put it at the top, take the second one and put it next, et cetera. Okay? So that's essentially the idea. That's all there is to it. Okay? So really what you have to know is, in those cases, is what are the URLs, what's the syntax for the calls that the provider is making, and then know how to read and interpret what comes back, and then do whatever you want with it. So if you want to look up books at Amazon, for example, you could find out it's essentially what it is. It's an API. Okay, and instead of an API like a subroutine library, it's a URL library that these and these are the web services we talk about, what the web service providers will provide. So if you go to Amazon, you know, Google Amazon API or something like that, and you'll find the URL strings and the commands, how you create the URLs when you do the gets. To say, you know, you give it a URL that has a query string on it that maybe has, you know, title equals something something something, and you do a get, and what it will return is a formatted right that has, you know, the book name, the title, the price, the authors, the ISBN, blah 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 blah, etc. Okay, and then you can do whatever you want with it. If you do it with Google, you can do a Google search that way, and then and then embed what comes back, or use whatever comes back, however you want. Or if you're doing Zillow, you know Zillow? Zillow's a real estate site. You would typically feed it an address, and it would return to you some kind of formatted string that gives you all the information about, you know, how old is it, how much taxes, what's it worth, blah, blah, blah. And then you can look up this whole sets of web service providers that do that sort of thing. And particularly if you're doing this, you know, just for low volume, just, you know, like what we're doing here, then you basically do it for free. You oftentimes, in order to make this work, you will oftentimes have to sign up with Amazon or Google or Zillow or whatever. They will give you a special key, some long, unique string that they know this is you, and then they expect that to be sent along with every request that you make. And as long as you keep the number of requests down to some reasonable number, you know, you're not like trying to run a multi-million-dollar business off of them for nothing. At which point they'll start to say, hey, wait a second. If you're going to use us that much, you should really be paying for it. And they will find out. So you can do this right now, okay, using your code. As long as you go through the process of signing up and knowing what the URLs are supposed to look like, you can, you know, actually make calls like this. This is essentially the web services, or one form of the web services that you hear about. Okay, so here's just a very trivial. Again, this is looking at this. This is vanilla stuff. So here is how do you process the feed. This is the thing that would get called when the ready state went to complete and if the request was okay. Then you could, for example, start to pick off those pieces and then stuff them into the HTML content of some spot on your page, okay, at will. So that's essentially the essence of how this works. So you see Ajax. Ajax is very heavily used everywhere, okay? It's difficult often to see unless you're looking for it, okay? probably the best way to see it as a developer is to actually use some of those tools that I introduced to you, like Firebug, HTTP Monitor. Those are those browser extensions, and things like that. Or even in our Glassfish world, et cetera, NetBeans, you can turn on HTTP monitoring so you can watch what's going back and forth, and you would be surprised how much of this is actually happening. And it actually would even be happening for your applications, even if you don't know it. Because as I said, JSF actually makes heavy use, and in PrimeFaces even more so, makes heavy use of Ajax to make everything more responsive and slicker, and more interactive, even though you don't necessarily see it. So, here's an example of, you're so used to this now. There was a time not that long ago when this didn't exist. The auto-completion of Google. When you start typing, a letter, and then all of a sudden you get a set of, how they pick what you see at the top of the list. I have no idea. But you know how this works. It's looking for what are called key up events. And on every key up, it's actually transmitting another request with the longer string. So the first key up is going to get the M and send that, and the Ajax response will be this list of M things. As soon as you hit the A, that's a second key up that's going to send a second request with an MA, right? Oh, this is Marty, my buddy, the author. Likewise with the T and the Y, etc. So that's actually how it's doing it. So each one of those key up events is generating an Ajax request. And the only thing that gets updated in this case is that the panel below the input field, okay, with the updated completions, okay, and then you can pick through them. What else? Google Maps is all Ajax. Okay, this is another perfect example of all the dragging and dropping and all that. That's all generating Ajax requests to get more data. Depending upon how you're, if you're zooming in, zooming out, clicking and dragging, moving it sideways, those are all generating Ajax requests to get data to respond to your movements. Kayak, that's another one. Kayak is a travel site. You can't really see it here, but if you actually tried to use it, you'd see how, you make one change, like on a date or on a price or something like that, and then immediately, the list of things that you see or the other parts of the page are going to change instantaneously. It's all over the place. Those are just, but the other ones, as I said, are, the Gmails and all those things are obvious too. So again, typically, what I just showed you just at least gives you the taste of what really is going on underneath. Goodness knows you don't actually use that unless you're some kind of a masochist. So you would typically use other tools that people have put a lot of work into to make that very easy. Now, in our case, JSF actually has built-in support for Ajax. And as I said, some of it actually you're not even seeing. But if you want to specifically do things that are Ajax specific, then you can use a JSF tag called, using the F namespace called F-Ajax, okay? This is where it's actually making calls to its own library, JavaScript library, which has Ajax support built into it, amongst other things. As I said, that's not the only one. PrimeFaces uses jQuery, and it makes very heavy use of Ajax underneath. So for example, in PrimeFaces, the Ajax is such an integral part of the UI components that in fact, you essentially have to turn off the Ajax for things like the command buttons, okay? You have to say Ajax equals false inside the command button to actually make it not use it, okay? And there are actually cases, if you think about this, remember, even though nowadays I think it's rare, you can turn JavaScript support off. okay, if you're being particularly paranoid, because there are security issues to do with JavaScript. Nowadays, I think you see what's happening, though, is that people, developers, rely on it so much that how many times, and this is I think a pretty recent phenomenon, only within the past year or so did I start to notice this, where a lot of sites, but at least the first time you go there, will say, hey, look, they'll put up some kind of a little banner and say, or at the bottom of the page and say, hey, look, we really, to use this place, you really need to use JavaScript. Is that okay? And cookies. Usually they also say, and cookies. Is that okay? So they're making it very obvious that if you don't, you can't really use the site. But, I mean, that is a trade-off. If you say that JavaScript is not working for some reason. One of the nice things about the JSF and prime faces stuff, for example, is if you write it, in a normal way, at least if you're a little conscious of it, there are ways of writing it such that it will still work even if it has to do a full page refresh, which would be the case if JavaScript were turned off for some reason. It would still function. It would just be obviously a little bit slower, but it would still work. Okay. So just a little review, because these terms come up when we're talking about the JSF and prime faces stuff. Use of Ajax is the execute and render portion. Remember, we went through this 6-phase life cycle of JSF, how the UI components are brought in and then validated, brought in, checked, converted, assuming they pass the conversion, then they're validated, assuming they pass the validations. Only then does the model get updated, because now that should be clean data. Then the business logic gets invoked, and then finally the response is rendered. In other words, whatever comes out the other end is generated. There's also, what you don't see here, is there's a short circuiting that can happen too. If one of those things fails, you typically will jump right to the render response. That's where the faces messages come in, okay? The error messages. Because obviously if you have a validation error, you don't want to go through the other parts. You want to just jump to the end and say, ooh, there was a problem. So you remember this, okay? The dark part there, shaded part, is what's called the execute portion, and then the render is that's the render part, okay? So you're going to see that this come up here. So what we mean by this is when JSF, executes one of these UI components, which is the button or the link or the input text or whatever, on the server, what it's really doing is it's converting and validating, as I just said. If it's an input, assuming it passes those things, it's pushing the values into the model, okay? And then it executes actions, action listeners, those things that are associated with it, assuming that the model has been updated properly. These would be the business logic, typically. And then eventually the response would be rendered properly. That's what happens here, is assuming all those things, well, either you jumped out because of an error, or it flowed naturally through and did everything it was supposed to do, then it gets rendered, which essentially you can think of as being translated into some standard HTML and sent back to the client. One of the other things the rendering does is, this is where those unique IDs, those funny looking JSF underscore blah, 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 those things that you sometimes see, are actually being generated, because the ID is an important thing to have for all those components. You can specify it, which you do, which I would recommend usually, because then it makes it easier for you to understand what's going on. But it will generate them anyhow. And so this is where that rendered attribute comes in. So every one of those essentially has that attribute, which you can then make use of. That's what I was showing you before with the fragment. And if it can be rendered, that, in other words, that's true, then in fact it will go, which is usually true, unless you were to say no, the component is translated and the HTML is sent to the client, okay? If it's false, that particular component, remember component means, that particular UI widget and its data and everything, it won't be included, okay? So normal requests, generally speaking, all of the components in the, let's say we're talking about forms usually, all the components in the form are executed and rendered. That's kind of the standard model for how everything has worked. What Ajax allows you to do is execute one or more. You need to execute at least one or more of the components. It could be 1, 2, all, some list. And then it renders 0 or more of the components. In other words, it could render nothing, that's possible, or it could represent, it could render 1 of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, all of them, etc. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. That's the difference. You actually can specify what gets executed and what gets rendered. And what this really means is that you can then update just portions of the page and render just portions of the page. In other words, this is what you would call partial processing. Rather than the standard style, if you're using just HTML forms, you're doing full processing. Okay? Everything gets sent. Everything has to be dealt with. Here you have a choice, and that's where you can actually really affect what gets transmitted and what gets updated. This is what you call partial processing. So Ajax can partially process the forms, and they can partially render the DOM elements on the client after the call comes back. And that's completely up to you. In JSF, the way this looks is you have, they're called, now this is there's a prime faces version of this, which uses a slightly different terminology. They use process and update, okay? But they're talking about essentially the same things. But this is the from the model, the life cycle, execute and render that I just showed you. So you execute the components and then you render components, and the choice of them is up to you. The way that you do this typically is the F Ajax is becomes an attribute essentially of the UI component. So in this case, the button here, command button, has an F Ajax. The event that it's looking for is a click on me in this case, execute me. The ID it's called me because the ID is me, and it will render @form. @form is a shorthand for everything on the form that I'm in, okay, at the moment. And then it closes it, okay? Now, in fact, all that Ajax stuff here is redundant in this particular case, because the command button does exactly this itself without you having to say it. However, I put it here just so that you get the idea of what's really going on. You can Ajaxify, if you want to call it that, virtually any of the UI components. So, for example, I don't remember if I've got the example of this. Well, here, let me see if I have an example that shows you that's different. Let's see. Okay, so that's the basic approach. You pick a component that you want to use with the Ajax. You identify the components to execute. You identify the components to render. Okay, and then you add that to it. Here's one. This is a slightly different one. It makes maybe a little more sense. So what's going to happen here? Now this is actually would look different. Now, assuming in this example, this blue example here, this you recognize it's an input text UI component. It's going to get its value from and put it into that bean. That's a sum managed bean, and something called sum property is going to get the value. So that part's all the same. If you add the Ajax to it, then what we're going to do And there are actually more attributes for F Ajax than just these. Basically, the event that we're going to look for, and you'll see later when I finish this, these events are the same as the JavaScript events, except without the word on. If you write normal JavaScript, you would say on key up, on click, on double click. So just drop the on, and that's what the words are. So basically what this is saying is when you let go of the key, you have hit it and let it go. As soon as you let it go, this event fires. And what are you going to do? Well, you're not going to do anything on the server side at this point. That's not what you're attempting to do here. You're going to render some other component. So let's say the other component is an output text component. So if you saw this and you started to type things into it, what do you think you would see on your page, assuming that the other component is, let's say, just right underneath it? Have any idea what this is actually doing? I can
Echoing the text that you're
Yeah,
typing.
that's exactly what it's doing. Every time you press a key and let it up, it's going to render the other component. And the other component, we're going to assume, has access to the same information, and so it's going to actually echo it without ever making a trip to the server, okay? In that case. So you get the idea? And so that could be on blur, blur. Blur means you're leaving the field altogether. It could be change, that's if you make any kind of a change to the field. Focus, when you're coming into it, you could do things. There's a whole set of those events that you could monitor. So there's an example of actually doing something different from its normal behavior. So you'll notice here, by the way, the execute equal is missing. If you leave it out, it means itself. Okay, so you don't actually have to say me or this or anything like that. It assumes that's what you're talking about. Okay. Now, these are the other tag attributes for F Ajax. Disabled true means you're disabling it. You can turn it off for some reason. Event, that's the set of events. Execute, I mentioned before. And actually, I may have this come up some other place. You have those @ shorthands. @ this means this particular component you're in. @ form means all the components in the form that I'm in. None means none, if you want to turn it off somehow. And all means in every component on the entire page, okay, in any form. All right. What else we got here? Immediate. This means that if you say immediate equals true, means that you short circuit any other things that would normally happen in the processing lifecycle. So it means that if for example, you have two fields, the second of which really depends upon the first one. If you, when the error comes up, if you say immediate equals true, it will catch the first one right away without ever letting you go, even if the second one is wrong. I mean, if let's say the two fields are required, okay? If the first one is not filled out, it's not going to tell you the second one is required because you never got to it yet. Okay, that's what immediate true is. I mean, otherwise it will say, oh, that one is missing and that one's missing too. Right, because I haven't gotten there yet. You see what I mean? On error, you can actually have it call a JavaScript function if the Ajax call fails for some reason. And then on event has to do with not those JavaScript events, but the Ajax events. Remember I showed you there's a process that goes through, unloaded, initialize, or whatever those 5 things were. You can actually track through so that if you wanted to catch it, just as it began but didn't return yet, you can monitor that. You can wait for it to complete, but it's not necessarily a success, or you can do it after the success. That's a little bit more arcane, but that's possible. You could I'm not even going to get into the listener, and that's already starting to get pretty arcane. But the render is obviously the thing that I mentioned. Okay, you can have either name things by IDs, you can name them by keywords, and you can have lists of things that you can specify. Or you can specify, well, that's the basic idea. I'd have to show you some more examples of that. So, like, this is the way that this would work. Here's the echo that I was telling you about. So this is another example of the same idea, where I specified the execute. This is if you left that out, it's exactly the same thing in this case. Let's see what else. ID equals echo. This is actually the output that would be echoed. Okay, that's basically that. So again, these are the attributes. You can say all, none, this, or form, the list of IDs. And also, another thing that's kind of useful is have a expression language list which resolves to a bunch of strings. So you can actually do it in a programmatic way, too. So here's just give me another 2-3 minutes and then I'll finish. One of the other things is this is a more fleshed out version of a lot of the things you've seen before. The action part of the command, the action listener part of the command, and then, which are part of, that's the normal command button, has those things. You've got the Ajax here, also has a listener. So you might ask yourself, which order do these things happen in? Okay, so if you ever need to remind yourself in terms of what gets called first when you actually click me, is the Ajax listener would happen first, then the action listener inside the component happens, then the action, which is normally the thing that, this is the thing that normally you're requesting the server to do for you. Okay, so there is an ordering involved there, just in case. It can get a little confusing if you've got more than one of these things in your Ajax. So here's a quick example. Here's a user data manage bean. Okay, you'll know what those are. You have a get welcome message, which basically says hello to whomever is calling it. So here is the example. Here is the execute is actually going to do when somebody types a name in and does the key up. Okay, what's going to happen is the output message is actually going to get updated character by character. And again, you might say, well, so what? What's the big deal here? The big difference is that in the old days, each one of these would cause the entire page to be, the request to be sent, the entire page would have to come back and be restored. Here, you're just essentially sending a character at a time, and what's coming back are small chunks, okay, that respond to that. So essentially what you're doing here is you're typing it in, it's getting echoed in the other thing. It's basically going to be saying, if I say, Ted, it's going to, I type a T, it's going to, in the other thing, it'll say hello T. Type the E, it'll say hello T-E, D, hello Ted, like that, character by character. And that's really the essence of what's going on with these Ajax type calls. Here's the example of it. I actually did it. This was actually Joe doing the same thing. Okay, so just to give you a flavor for that, I can generate more examples if you like, but there are lots of places to find examples of that. So what I may do next time is please read over that mega app thing in the book there, and maybe I'll use that as a set of talking points to talk about how an application is put together, and maybe tease out some interesting questions out of that. Okay? So thank you for giving me a few extra minutes there.